Hello everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In our last episode, the Queen had a busy time when her daughter, the Queen, and her husband, Prince Philip, had to take a 5-month tour of the Commonwealth. The Queen had to deal with the royal business while they were gone, as well as being a substitute mother for Prince Charles and Princess Anne. She enjoyed both her duties, and then she had to take a 3-week tour of the United States and Canada. She didn't look forward to the fact that there was no family member going with her, but she felt a sense of triumph that she still had an important role in public life. So let's see what's going on today. President Eisenhower sent his private plane to bring the Queen Mother to Washington, where she had another full week of formal appearances, visits, and meals, including visits to the White House, the National Gallery of Art, and tours of Virginia and Maryland, which she found delightful. The Queen found life in the Eisenhower White House more formal than it had been with the Roosevelts, and surrounded by more protocol. According to the British ambassador, Sir Roger Makins, he said that the Eisenhowers took evident pleasure in entertaining her as an old friend. The Makinses were informal too, and at least once they all had a midnight supper on the stairs of the ambassador's residence. Despite the informality, security was much tighter than in 1939. Her Secret Service people were just like nannies who, she told the Queen, look after one, and look also faintly disapproving or rather loving. I'd like to have 1 or 2 to take home. In Virginia, she liked their kindness in the southern drawls. Mighty kind, ma'am, they'd say, taking longer than you can believe to say mighty. She was happy with her trip. She found Americans charming, courteous, and reassuringly old-fashioned. She was also moved by the fact that many people remembered her 1939 visit with the king, and although they did not quite understand how the monarchy worked, they were prepared to look kindly on the family. From Washington, she flew to Ottawa on Friday, November the 12th. The Canadian part of her trip was briefer and more demure than in the States, but it was also a happy time nonetheless. She was on home soil, reported the High Commissioner. Her time was spent mostly in Ottawa, and among her engagements she opened by-town bridges. She drove through the city, visited City Hall, and went to a performance of White Oaks at the Canadian Repertory Theatre, held in aid of the Canadian Mothercraft Society, of which she was a patron. The visit made the Queen love Canada all over again. It was a Commonwealth country to which she returned most often in the remaining years of her life. On the afternoon of November 17th, the Queen Mother flew back to New York to embark on the Queen Mary. She gave a private dinner party on board that night, and the next morning after leave, taking ceremony in the Veranda Grill, the ship set sail. The voyage home was much calmer than on the way out. Those who witnessed the trip were in no doubt about its success. From Ottawa, the High Commissioner reported home that the Queen Mother had done an immense amount to strengthen ties between Britain and Canada. From Washington, Roger Makins enthused that she had been flawless. The informal moments endeared her to the American public. Her warmth was so foreign to the copybook idea of royalty and the American mind that she had captivated everybody. The Queen's most cherished response came in a private letter from Winston Churchill, in which he praised the success of her visit. The maintenance and continuous improvement of friendship between the English-speaking peoples, and more especially between these islands and the great North American democracies, is a safeguard of the future. Your Majesty has made a notable contribution to this end, and I think it is fitting that the ministers of the Crown should be among the first to recognize it. She had enjoyed the trip much more than she had expected, and she realized, perhaps for the first time, what a strong impact she could have as an ambassador for Britain. Her success stimulated her. Now she could see that she could play a useful part in promoting both the monarchy and Britain herself in overseas visits. In years to come, foreign travel to France, to Africa, to Australia, and to Canada again would be a very important part of her work. In 1955, Princess Margaret had a second crisis with Peter Townsend and their relationship. On August 21st, she turned 25, so under the Royal Marriages Act, she was free to marry without the permission of the sovereign. The last 2 years weren't all bad. The princess was vivacious and, if moody, also witty and often charming. She had admirers, and she was seen around town, always chic and sometimes carrying an elegant cigarette holder, with such men as Colin Tennant, son of Lord Glenconner, who had been one of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's admirers, Dominic Elliot, and Mark Bonham Carter. At the beginning of 1955, Princess Margaret had made a successful tour of the Caribbean. She liked the way of life there, and her enjoyment showed. A Nassau paper commented that she resembled her mother in her warmth, humanity, simplicity, and interest in people. By the end of her 2-year waiting period, it became clear that she and Townsend would not be left in peace to make their decision. Press speculation increased, with some papers being supportive, and the Daily Mirror stated, "Come on, Margaret, please make up your mind." It was printed just before her birthday, which she spent quietly at Balmoral. It was painful for her and the rest of the royal family. The Queen Mother didn't find it easy to discuss intimate matters of the heart. She found it easier to write letters, and she told her in a letter, "My darling Margaret, I sometimes wonder whether you quite realize how much I hate having to point out the more difficult and occasionally horrid problems. It would be so much easier to gloss them over, but I feel such a deep sense of responsibility as your only living parent, and I seem to be the only person who can point them out, and you can imagine what anguish it causes me. I suppose that every mother wants her child to be happy, and I now know what a miserable and worrying time you're having, torn by so many difficult constitutional and moral problems. I think about it and you all the time, and because I have to talk over the horrid things does not mean that I don't suffer with you, or that one's love is any less. I have wanted to write this for a long time, as it is something which might sound embarrassing if said. Your very loving Mummy." And Princess Margaret wrote back at once, "Darling Mummy, your letter did help so much. Thank you for writing it. As you said, it's easier to write than to say, but please don't think that because I have blown up at intervals when we discussed the situation, that I didn't know how you felt. I knew only too well that you were feeling for one tremendously." She went on to say that there were very few people to whom she could talk about her feelings, and it was very difficult to make such decisions alone. "Oh dear, I meant to tell you how much your letters meant, and I've only poured out a lot of complaints, but it did, and you will now know that I know what you are feeling when we next talk." She told her mother that Peter Townsend was coming over from Brussels in mid-October for them to meet and talk. Before he arrived, Queen Elizabeth talked to her daughter on the telephone from the castle of May. She felt she had to be guarded because one feels that so many people are listening most eagerly. But then she wrote, "I did want to say, darling, that I know what a great decision you have to make fairly soon, and to beg you to look at it from every angle, and to be quite sure that you don't marry somebody because you're sorry for them. Marriage is such a momentous step and so intimate, and it is far, far better to be a little cruel and say no to marriage unless you are quite sure." She felt that some people made wonderful friends and confidants, but less successful husbands. Poor Peter has had a ghastly time, but I'm sure that he would agree that a marriage could not be truly happy unless both were prepared to face the extraordinary difficulties with clear consciences. Oh, I do feel for you, darling. It is so hard that you should have to go through so much agony of mind. Princess Margaret felt that now that she had turned 25, she could still marry Peter Townsend if she wished, and the government, and by extension Parliament, would allow her marriage to go ahead without further ado, as the Royal Marriages Act permitted. It was not that simple. Anthony Eden, Winston Churchill's successor as Prime Minister, was himself divorced, but he could not or would not do battle on behalf of the princess. After taking soundings among his cabinet colleagues, he indicated that if asked for advice, the government could not recommend the marriage should go ahead. And if the princess decided to marry nonetheless, it was clear that Parliament, which under the Royal Marriages Act would have to give its permission, would not allow the third in line to the throne to enter into a marriage which the Church would not recognize. She would have to renounce her royal status. On October 26, the Times published a fierce editorial in which it declared if she chose Townsend, she would have to abandon her royal status, and she would be letting down the Queen, the symbol of people's better selves. Princess Margaret had external pressures and also inner conflicts. She was in love, but her mother had always instructed her children, as Lady Strathmore had instructed hers, that duty came first. The princess believed in the sanctity of marriage. She was intensely loyal to her sister and to the institution in which she had grown up. She was well aware of the agony of her mother and father, and the consternation in the country when King Edward VIII had insisted on marrying a divorced woman. Her mother and her sister both wanted the princess happiness. They were both careful not to push her either way, but all three of them understood how hard it would be for her if she had to renounce the whole basis of her life and change her close relationships within the royal family. She made up her mind. According to Princess Margaret, when she and Peter Townsend met shortly afterwards at Clarence House, they both decided at the same moment that it's not possible, it won't do. The princess went to inform the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Geoffrey Fisher, of her decision, and he responded at once, "What a wonderful person the Holy Spirit is." The princess and Townsend worked together on a statement for her to release to the press. They went through several drafts, and the final version stated, "I would like it to be known that I've decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend." She had been aware that, subject to renouncing her rights of succession, she could have contracted a civil marriage, but mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriages is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others. The statement, on which the Queen Mother also gave her advice, went on to say, "I have reached this decision entirely alone, and in doing so have been strengthened by the unfailing support and devotion of Group Captain Townsend." The statement was issued October 1955. The Daily Mirror had the headline, "Duty Before Love." The princess received thousands of sympathetic letters, and Jean Rakin helped her reply to them. One was from her former teacher, Tony de Bellaigue, to whom the princess was devoted. Jean Rakin wrote to her, "She is absolutely wonderful about it all. Fortunately, they both decided at the same time they could not marry, so there was not the agony of one changing. Since they reached this decision some days before it was announced, they had both become progressively more sure." She said that the princess, having been through agonies, was amazingly calm now, but she expected there would be a reaction at some time. It seemed too much for any person to bear this hideous publicity and criticism. "Our newspapers are abominable. Queen Elizabeth looks very tired. The strain of these last weeks is telling." 3 weeks later, Princess Margaret herself wrote to Tony, telling her, "I must tell you quickly that Peter and I are calm and rather peacefully happy, because they both decided at exactly the same second that we couldn't get married. That was it. We did it together. So you see, instead of feeling a tremendous wrench, we both in fact joined even more strongly together by the fact that our love had been strong enough to enable us to take the more difficult course. And there we were, and our love had triumphed in a way neither of us had ever dreamt could give us any satisfaction or happiness. But it has." Her face, she said, had helped both of them. "We always dared to believe it was God's love we were given a little love to love with, only we thought he meant us to marry, until we found out it was not so. Then all our love and what we had tried to do by might have seemed in vain, but the strength we were given to make this decision and the feeling of renewal we felt after it, we think humbly that perhaps this is what he ordained." Queen Elizabeth had escaped for a night to the peace and calm of St. Paul's Walden with her brother David. She also spent a weekend with the Salisburys in Dorset in mid-November. The Queen Mother wrote a kind letter to Peter Townsend, for which he thanked her, and he assured her that he would give Princess Margaret every help in remaking her life. "I know that she now feels a great peace of mind in having reached the right decision, and so do I. I hope your Majesty will be able to realize how conscious I have felt of your understanding throughout a time which has given you so much anxiety." The problem now for Princess Margaret, as her mother, her sister, and other members of her family understood, was to find ways for her to occupy her time. She had enjoyed an income of £5,000 a year from the civil list, in return for which she carried out the public duties of a junior member of the royal family. She was colonel-in-chief of several regiments and patron of a number of charities, including the Royal Ballet, which became one of her most important and enduring interests. After the princess's final separation from Townsend, she was lonely and didn't find it easy to confine her feelings in other members of the family. In autumn of 1956, she went on a trip to the Indian Ocean in Britannia to visit Mauritius, Zanzibar, Tanganyika, and Kenya. She had moments of misery, but was, she said, cheered by her mother's telephone calls and glorious letters which made her laugh out loud. She still hankered after Townsend and felt depressed at times, as she told her mother in a letter written towards the end of her trip. After her return, she and her mother continued living together at Clarence House. This wasn't an ideal arrangement for either of them. Princess Margaret considered having a house of her own, but rejected it. She said, on the grounds of both loneliness and expense. It may come, but of course I might marry someone. So I will end the video here. The Queen Mother enjoyed her time in America representing Britain. She realized what a strong impact she could have as an ambassador for Britain. It would lead to numerous overseas trips, being an ambassador. As Margaret made it through 2 years and discovered in order to marry Townsend, she would have to give up her royal position. She was intensely loyal to her sister and to the institution in which she had grown up. She and Townsend had reached the same conclusion at the same time, and she felt that God helped them to reach their decision to break up the relationship. I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. As I've said before, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in. If you click on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page, and if you purchase it, I get a small commission that is of no extra cost to you. But more importantly, I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you.